Belhaven Plantation, Richmond, Virginia. The air is heavy, August thick, where even the cicadas seem reluctant to sing. In the stable, the world feels softer. The smell of hay, the quiet rhythm of brushing bristles against a glossy brown coat. Here, a young woman named Lucy finds her only sanctuary. 28 years old, enslaved, silenced by years of cruelty, and yet, in this one stall, she breathes freely. The horse shifts under her hand. His name is Freedom. Lucy gave him that name not as a joke, not as rebellion, but as a prayer she could whisper in secret. To her, he is not property. He is companion, confidant, and the only living creature who ever met her gaze without demanding anything in return. Each night, she rests her forehead against his muzzle, feeling the warmth of breath against her skin, as if the universe is still capable of gentleness. But peace on Belhaven never lasts long. Shadows move differently here. Overseers with whips at their sides strut like kings, drunk on small power. Their laughter carries a cruelty sharper than any blade. And though Lucy has learned to keep her eyes low, to fold herself into silence, they have not failed to notice the bond between her and this horse. To them, affection is a crime. Love, even for an animal, is defiance. And defiance must always be punished. One night, the stable doors creak open. Torches spill firelight across the hay. 10 men enter, boots dragging mud, voices thick with liquor. Lucy sees them before she hears them, their outlines cutting through the dark like wolves circling prey. At first, she does not understand. Then she notices the ropes. 4 corners. 4 stakes. A trap. They seize Freedom. He bucks, muscles straining, eyes wide with terror. Lucy lunges forward, but the butt of a rifle slams into her ribs, dropping her to her knees. The men laugh. She doesn't scream. She doesn't beg. She just watches. Whips crack across Freedom's flank, splitting skin with sounds like snapping branches. Flames kiss his coat, burning hair and flesh. Their laughter grows louder as the animal shrieks. Lucy stays frozen, eyes locked, hands trembling against the dirt. When the axes come, she presses her forehead against the ground, not in surrender, but in a vow. The final moments are slow. The horse collapses, chest heaving, muzzle reaching weakly toward Lucy. Not fear, recognition. Trust. She crawls forward, presses her face against his one last time. His breath rattles, then fades. Silence. The overseers leave her there in the ashes of laughter and blood, expecting broken sobs. But Lucy doesn't cry. She kneels until dawn. With bare hands, she digs a shallow grave, covering Freedom with soil, feed sacks, and whispered promises. 10 for 1, she murmurs. 1 each night. That night, Belhaven lost an obedient servant, and something older, colder, and sharper took her place. Long before Belhaven, before Richmond, before the night when Freedom's blood stained the hay, Lucy had already learned to survive in silence. She was born in Charleston, South Carolina. Not into childhood, not into innocence, but into bondage. Her earliest memories were of footsteps echoing through narrow hallways and whispers that seemed louder than shouts. Her mother, gone by the time Lucy was 7, sold off in the chaos of debt. No goodbye, no trace. Just a hole in the world where safety used to be. From that day forward, Lucy never cried in public again. She discovered something even sharper than tears. Silence. Silence was armor. It let her move unseen. It let her listen. In the house where she was enslaved, Lucy watched and absorbed. She noticed the way her mistress's eyes moved across letters, the way fingers lingered over certain names. She studied how pages turned, how ledgers carried power. She never read aloud, never risked exposure, but she matched shapes to meaning, piece by piece. Soon she could recognize words that were never meant for her eyes: receipts for slaves, rations, whips, inventories. One night, pale moonlight spilling through a pantry window, Lucy saw her own name written down. Property. Female. Age. 18. Valued for domestic labor. She stared at that word, property, until it no longer made sense. That night, she stopped answering to it. At auctions, she learned to keep her face still as men poked her arms, checked her teeth, and appraised her body like livestock. But inside, she was studying them, their expressions, their habits, the small cracks in their confidence. Every insult, every casual cruelty, she stored away, not out of immediate rebellion, but out of patient calculation. When Belhaven's master, Nathaniel Harrington, purchased her, he thought he'd found a woman with a strong back and calm eyes. What he didn't realize was that those calm eyes were sharp, watching everything. Harrington valued order above all, and Lucy, quiet and efficient, quickly became useful. She memorized inventories, organized kitchens, and even taught others to preserve food in clever ways. Harrington moved her into the big house, but Lucy asked for the stables instead. Amused, he agreed. It was there that she found a trembling foal, unwanted and overlooked, dismissed as weak. She named him Freedom, and in nurturing him, she found something she hadn't felt since her mother vanished: connection. When the young horse pressed his head against her chest, it was as though the world briefly stopped burning. But Belhaven was a place where joy was suspicious. Overseers saw the bond between woman and horse, muttered under their breath, mocked her quiet dignity. She thought she was somebody, they sneered. They promised she'd learn her place. Lucy heard them. She always heard everything. And though she stayed silent, her silence was not submission. It was preparation. Because even then, years before the night of fire and whips, Lucy was already sharpening herself against the sound of their cruelty. When Lucy first arrived at Belhaven Plantation, she stepped into a world that looked orderly on the surface, but bled cruelty underneath. The Harrington estate sprawled across acres of tobacco and cotton fields, its white-columned house gleaming like a monument to power. But the beauty was skin-deep. Behind the polished doors, discipline was as strict as scripture, and suffering was woven into the land like thread through cloth. Nathaniel Harrington prided himself on being a Christian gentleman. He rarely dirted his own hands. His cruelty was cold, not chaotic, carried out through ledgers, contracts, and the overseers who served as his fists. Belhaven wasn't a plantation of chaos, it was a machine. Every whip crack, every ration counted, every life catalogued like stock. Lucy understood this machine almost immediately. She had been trained by silence her whole life to notice things others overlooked: who rose before dawn, who drank too much, who lingered too long near the sugar barrels. She didn't challenge the system. Not yet, but she studied it like a map. Most enslaved people dreaded the stables. The work was dirty, the smell strong, and the animals often dangerous. But Lucy asked for them. Harrington, amused by her request, agreed. He saw no threat in letting her muck stalls and mend tack. What he didn't know was that she was claiming the only sanctuary she could carve out of Belhaven's iron grip. In the corner stall of that stable, Lucy met the foal who would change everything. Barely weaned, trembling, considered useless by the stable master. His ribs showed, his legs wobbled, his spirit fragile. But Lucy saw something else. She fed him by hand, brushed his coat until it gleamed, whispered to him in the dark when no one else cared. Slowly, the foal grew stronger. His steps steadied. His eyes grew bright. And when he began to answer only to her voice, she named him Freedom. For Lucy, caring for freedom was more than labor. It was communion. His presence reminded her that she was still human in a world determined to deny it. When his head rested against her chest, she could almost forget the chains that bound her. But overseers notice everything, especially joy. They saw how the horse leaned into her touch, how Lucy smiled, faintly, but genuinely, when brushing his mane. To them, this bond was dangerous. An enslaved woman wasn't supposed to love anything, much less claim authority over a thoroughbred. Their mutters turned to sneers. She thinks she's somebody. Let her enjoy it while it lasts. Lucy heard them, but kept silent. She continued to work, day after day, with quiet devotion. Yet inside, she sensed the unease growing. Belhaven's overseers were not content to let her keep even this one small piece of happiness. And she knew, deep down, that the stables, her sanctuary, were also her greatest vulnerability. The night Freedom died, the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. Thick clouds smothered the moon, and the silence of the fields was broken only by the crunch of boots and the creak of the stable doors. Lucy stood frozen as 10 overseers poured inside, torches flickering against sweat-stained faces. At first, she didn't understand. Then she saw the ropes. 4 men yanked them tight, binding Freedom to the stable beams. His muscles trembled, eyes rolling in panic. Lucy rushed forward, but the blow of a rifle butt crushed her ribs, sending her to her knees. They began with whips. The sharp cracks tore through the air, each strike cutting skin, each laugh cutting deeper. Torches pressed against his flanks until the stench of burned flesh choked the stable. Then came the axes. The men didn't want to kill quickly. They wanted her to watch. And Lucy did. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She memorized every face, every laugh, every swing of the blade. Freedom collapsed at last, gasping, his head reaching weakly toward her. It wasn't fear she saw in his eyes, but recognition, trust, even at the end. She pressed her forehead to his muzzle, whispering nothing, because there were no words left. His last breath rattled through the hay, and silence fell. The men spat, laughed, and stumbled away into the night. To them, it was a game, a warning, a way of reminding Lucy of her place. They expected broken sobs, hysterical collapse. But Lucy remained kneeling beside the body until dawn's first light. With bare hands, she dug a grave in the stable yard. Dirt lodged beneath her nails, her fingers blistered, her arms shook with exhaustion, but she did not stop. She buried Freedom with old feed sacks, whispering promises into the soil. 10 for 1, she said. 1 each night. In that moment, something in Lucy shifted forever. The obedient servant died beside that grave. In her place stood something the overseers could never have imagined. Patience sharpened into a blade. She didn't rage outwardly. She didn't plot aloud. She folded her grief into silence and began to listen more closely than ever before. She listened to footsteps on the wooden porches, to the coughs that betrayed weakness, to the habits that made men predictable. Each overseer had a routine, and Lucy mapped them with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. She would not rush. Revenge, she knew, must be carved carefully, slowly, one night at a time. By the time she whispered her last words over Freedom's grave, the choice had already been made. Lucy would wait, watch, and strike, not once, not in fury, but 10 times, until every man who laughed that night was buried in the same silence they had forced upon her. And for the first time in her life, Lucy's silence wasn't survival. It was a promise. After Freedom's grave was sealed, Lucy moved differently through Belhaven. To the overseers, she was still quiet, dutiful, invisible. But beneath that mask, her mind sharpened into calculation. Every routine became a weakness. Every habit a window. She had etched their names into her memory like scars. Henry, Samuel, James, Matthew, Elias, William, Thomas, George, Caleb, Frank. 10 men. 10 deaths. The first was Henry McCallum, the oldest overseer, and the one who delivered the killing blow to Freedom. He walked with a limp when it rained, a pistol always on his desk, a bottle of whiskey never far from his hand. Henry prided himself on his authority, convinced that age had earned him respect. But in Lucy's eyes, he was already a dead man. On the 3rd day after Freedom's death, the skies opened. Rain pounded the fields, washing away tracks, cloaking sound. Overseers huddled indoors, but Henry retreated to his office shack, as he always did. He closed the door, sat at his desk, poured himself a drink. Routine. Predictable. Vulnerable. Lucy slipped in barefoot through the back. She carried a hoof knife, curved and narrow, sharpened until its edge gleamed like ice. She had chosen it with care, quiet, efficient, meant for precision. For several seconds, she stood behind him, watching the steam rise from his cup, the way his gray hair curled against his neck. Then the blade slid between his ribs. Henry gasped, but her hand clamped over his mouth. The knife struck again and again, not wild, not chaotic, measured, deliberate. When his body finally sagged, Lucy adjusted the scene. She placed the bottle in his hand, tucked him into his chair, made it look like a man who had drunk himself to death at his desk. By dawn, whispers spread. Henry found dead, blood under his chin, maybe whiskey, maybe his heart. The overseers muttered, speculated. No one suspected Lucy. She stirred stew, polished brass, fed chickens as though nothing had changed. Yet deep inside, something shifted. Not joy, not relief, but movement. Like an old door opening after years sealed shut. 3 nights later, Samuel Brigg met his end. Younger, crueler, the one who had kicked freedom in the jaw. Samuel liked to inspect the cotton rows at dawn, alone for 20 minutes in the same stretch every morning. Lucy prepared the spot the night before, hiding the knife in a burlap sack beneath the stalks. When Samuel passed the 3rd time, she followed. A quick strike beneath the ribs. A hand pulling him down into the cotton. The soil drank his blood, as if it had been waiting. When his body was found, face down in a trench, overseers muttered again. Maybe he drank too much, maybe a rival killed him. But Lucy knew better. She walked past the ditch later, paused, and whispered to the soil. 1. Then a day later, 2. The count had begun. By the time Samuel's body was dragged from the trench, unease had begun to ripple through Belhaven. 1 overseer dead could be dismissed as misfortune. 2, within days, was something else entirely. Whispers carried faster than the wind. But Lucy? She remained silent, watchful, invisible, the steady hands that kept kitchens running, water poured, sheets folded. The perfect mask. Her 3rd target was James Hooper. Unlike Samuel, James thought himself a reasonable man. He gave warnings before punishments, liked to imagine he wasn't cruel. But Lucy remembered the boy he had locked in a shed for hours, emerging broken, his eyes swollen shut. James didn't scream or spit like the others. He smiled while you suffered, and to Lucy, that made him no less guilty. Every afternoon, James napped in the tool shed, heat pressing down on the tin roof. Same corner, same crate, hat over his face, boots off. The perfect trap. Lucy didn't carry a knife this time. She brought rope. As he dozed, she slipped behind, looped it around his neck, and pulled with steady force. His legs thrashed, arms clawed, but Lucy's grip did not falter. When his body went limp, she hoisted the rope over a beam, staged the scene with a barrel beneath his feet, and left him swinging. By dusk, his corpse dangled in the hot air, discovered by horrified voices. A suicide, they claimed. But overseers didn't hang themselves. Not here, not like that. Doubt began to creep into their eyes. Lucy walked among them, carrying water, listening to every tremor in their voices. That night, she returned to the shed alone and whispered into the dark. 3. The 4th came by the river. Matthew, the overseer who fished on Thursdays, flask in hand, hymns on his lips. He fancied himself a man of faith, but faith had not stopped him from laughing when freedom bled. Lucy waited in the reeds, the air thick with the smell of mud and rot. When Matthew's head tilted back, drinking deep from his flask, she struck. Knife in the ribs, hand clamped over his mouth, dragging him away from the bank. His hymn ended in a gurgle. She cut out his tongue with fishing line, not for cruelty, but for silence. By morning, his body floated downstream, face pale, arms outstretched. For overseers gone in 4 weeks. Belhaven's rhythm faltered. Overseers carried weapons even to supper, muttered of curses, ghosts, demons. Torches burned through the night. Dogs barked without rest. Still, Lucy moved in shadows, calm, patient. She wasn't rushing. She was counting. Each death precise. Each routine exploited. Each silence deeper than the last. And by the time William, the youngest overseer, took his post at the southern gate, everyone at Belhaven knew something hunted them. They just hadn't realized yet that the hunter was already among them, pouring their water, folding their sheets, and whispering numbers into the soil. By the 5th week, Belhaven no longer slept. Lanterns burned through the night. Rifles leaned against bed frames. Even the bravest overseers avoided walking alone. The air itself seemed haunted, heavy with suspicion. But Lucy? She moved as she always had, head lowered, hands busy, face unreadable. The overseers began to unravel. William, the youngest, barely 22, shook with nerves at every creak of the floorboards. He begged to be reassigned from a Sunday post at the southern gate, but Harrington refused. Routine was discipline, and discipline meant control. So William sat there alone, perching on the split-rail fence with his rifle, chewing bark, muttering to himself like a man already half-mad. Lucy waited for the bell that signaled every man was at his station. Barefoot, silent, she carried a blacksmith's hammer instead of a blade. When the moment came, she slipped through the cane, crouched low. William's voice trembled. "Ain't no ghosts. Ain't no curses." The hammer fell across his neck with a crack that echoed like dry wood snapping. The second blow crushed his skull. Lucy dragged him into the cane, folding his arms across his chest before breaking each of his fingers, one for every man who had laughed when freedom screamed. By morning, William's corpse was stiff, his head caved in. One overseer fainted. Another wept openly. The plantation's fear thickened into panic. Harrington brought in armed men from Richmond, their boots too clean, their eyes too cold. They searched cabins, questioned workers, even eyed Lucy herself. But they found nothing. She remained invisible, pouring water into their cups with hands steady as stone. Now only 4 overseers remained, and one of them, Elias Granger, began to collapse under his own fear. Elias had been loud, vulgar, the kind of man who cursed like prayer and drank like breath. He had laughed hardest when freedom was torn apart. But now he jumped at every rustle, slept with a shotgun clutched to his chest, muttered names in his sleep. Lucy let him stew in terror. She followed him in shadows, appeared in reflections, left him doubting every sound. His fear became her weapon. At last, unable to endure the waiting, Elias packed a bag one midnight, coins in his boot, pistol wrapped in cloth. He tried to flee through the back trail toward the woods. But Lucy knew the forest like she knew silence. She let him think he was escaping. Then she stepped into his path. Elias froze, recognizing her face at last. "No," he rasped. "No, it ain't you." He fired once, then again, missing both times. She didn't flinch. When he tripped over a root, Lucy was already there, hammer in hand. 2 strikes, and his fear ended in silence. By dawn, Belhaven whispered of curses louder than ever. Another overseer gone. Another shadow added to their nightmares. And Lucy stood among them, quiet as ever, whispering to the earth beneath her feet. 7. By the time only a few names remained, Belhaven was a plantation ruled not by order, but by dread. Overseers no longer barked commands with confidence. Their voices cracked, their eyes darted. And at the center of this unraveling sat Nathaniel Harrington, the master himself. Harrington had always prided himself on control. He signed papers with a steady hand, quoted scripture to justify cruelty, and allowed overseers to carry out the dirtier parts of his power. He had never raised a whip himself. To him, that distance preserved the illusion of refinement. But illusions crumble fast when death moves like a shadow through your land. One by one, Lucy had erased his fists. And though Harrington never admitted it aloud, the fear had reached him too. He saw it in the nervous glances of his men, in the way they now carried weapons even to supper, in the restless dogs that seemed to bark at nothing. And yet, Harrington's pride would not let him leave. This was his estate, his legacy, and he clung to it even as it rotted beneath him. Years passed. The Civil War came and went. Emancipation swept through like fire, tearing apart the old order. Belhaven, once a machine of profit, became a hollow shell. Half the fields overgrown, the big house echoing with ghosts. Overseers long dead, workers vanished into freedom or into the soil. And Harrington remained, older, weaker, bitter. His voice cracked, his lungs rattled like dry beans in a jar. He spent his days in bed, alone in a house too big for one man. The plantation that once obeyed him now mocked him with silence. It was in this hollowed-out place that Lucy returned. Not as an enslaved woman. Not even as Lucy. She came under a new name, Mary Carter, a widow claiming to be a nurse trained by missionaries. Age had straightened her back, but sharpened her eyes. The years had cooled her voice into something softer, but colder. No one recognized her. To the few servants who remained, she was just another hired caretaker. To Harrington, she was simply girl, or help. He never looked closely enough to see the truth. Lucy washed his sheets, dabbed his forehead with cloths, spooned broth into his mouth. To all appearances, she was devoted. But at night, when wind rattled the shutters, Harrington's eyes would grow wide. He whispered of ghosts. He spoke to shadows. Sometimes, he clutched her wrist and rasped, "They're coming." Lucy leaned close, her silence a mirror. And though once or twice his gaze flickered with recognition, it always passed, clouded by fever and fear. She waited 7 days. 7 nights of thunder and sickness, of listening to his wheezing breath. Then, on a storm-soaked night, she entered his room with a pillow in her hands. Harrington opened his eyes, and for a moment, the truth struck him. "Lucy," he whispered, weak, pleading. She said nothing. The pillow came down. His struggle was pitiful, a shadow of the power he once held. In minutes, silence swallowed him. And with it, Belhaven's master fell. When Nathaniel Harrington's last breath rattled into silence, Lucy didn't linger. She gathered only a few things. A brooch she had hidden since Charleston, a letter she once wrote to the child they sold from her, and the steel resolve that had carried her this far. By the time servants raised alarm, she was already gone, slipping into the storm, disappearing into the dark roads north. Her name vanished with her. No longer Lucy, no longer property, no longer bound to Belhaven. She became Mary Carter, a widow with a quiet dignity and a talent for hard work. In Philadelphia, she built a small laundry business. She married. She raised children. To neighbors and customers, she was just a kind woman with sharp eyes and strong hands. Her grandchildren adored her. They knew her as a stern but loving grandmother who told them not to trust men who smiled with ledgers. They never questioned why. They never suspected that the same gentle hands folding linens had once dragged bodies through cotton fields, or that the same steady gaze that calmed their tears had once stared into the terrified eyes of men moments before death. Lucy never spoke of Belhaven again. Her silence became her shield once more, this time not for survival, but for peace. Perhaps she wanted to protect her family from the weight of her past. Perhaps she understood that vengeance, though righteous, can curdle into shadow if carried too long. And yet, the land remembered. Soil does not forget the blood it drinks. Trees do not forget the whispers they sheltered. The wind does not forget the silence it carried. Decades later, in 1925, Lucy, now Mary, passed away peacefully, surrounded by children and grandchildren who thought they knew her story. She left them love, discipline, and resilience. But she did not leave them the truth. That truth belonged only to her, to freedom, and to the earth of Richmond. Still, legends have a way of surviving, even when spoken in hushed tones. Among the Black community in Virginia, whispers lingered of a woman who had avenged her horse, who had struck terror into the overseers of Belhaven. Her name, half remembered, traveled like smoke, Lucy, the Avenger of Richmond. Some dismissed it as folklore, a tale too wild to be real. Others swore by it, passing it down as quiet proof that even in the darkest times, defiance lived. Lucy had become what she never intended, a myth. A figure who haunted the soil she once walked, and whose silence thundered louder than the overseer's whips. She had disappeared into another life, but her shadow stretched longer than the plantation that once claimed to own her. History has a way of burying inconvenient truths. For decades, Lucy's name faded into silence, just as she intended. But silence cannot stop the earth from speaking. Years after her death, Belhaven was no longer a plantation. The war had ended, slavery abolished, and the land had changed hands until it was little more than a decaying estate. Eventually, investors sought to restore it as a historical site, a monument to the Old South. Crews arrived to clear fields, repair buildings, and unearth foundations. What they found instead were bones. Beneath sugar sheds, in drainage trenches, under piles of stone, skeletons emerged. Some had fingers broken one by one. One had no tongue. Another bore ribs, shattered by blunt force. Scattered among them lay rusted tools, a blacksmith's hammer, a bone-handled knife, a hoof blade long forgotten by men, but not by the earth. To historians, it was mystery. To locals, it was confirmation. They had always known the whispers were true. Lucy's vengeance had not been erased. It had been etched into the very soil. A guide from Richmond, an older black man, looked at the recovered hoof knife and said only, "I know who did this." When asked to elaborate, he smiled faintly. "And I ain't telling, because she didn't do it for the history books. She did it for the blood." Lucy's story never made it into polished plantation tours or textbooks that still try to soften the brutality of slavery. But among those who understood the language of survival, her name traveled like a secret hymn. She was a reminder that even in the most brutal systems, resistance could bloom in silence, in patience, in precision. Freedom's grave may have vanished beneath weeds, but his spirit lived on in her vow. 10 for 1. And in fulfilling it, Lucy carved her own kind of freedom, not given, but taken. Today, when visitors walk through the remnants of Belhaven, they see whitewashed walls, reconstructed porches, curated exhibits. But the land remembers differently. Every gust of wind through the cane, every shift of soil beneath boots, carries traces of Lucy's defiance. And perhaps that is the truest legacy. Not the sanitized plaques or guided tours, but the whispered stories passed down quietly, defiantly, so that those who bled in silence are not forgotten. Lucy, the woman who turned grief into a weapon, who carved justice out of silence, who left behind not just myth, but proof. Her story is not just about vengeance. It is about what happens when love, once destroyed, refuses to die quietly. And though history may never fully honor her, the earth has already written her name.